Bernard Tobin here at the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association's Deep Dive MicroSmart look at micronutrients. And I'm joined now by Dr. John Lauzon, University of Guelph soil scientist. Professor, sir, how's it going?
Very good, and thank you for having me on.
John, you just ran through a bunch of micronutrients, and obviously the focus of today's conversation. And what I want to focus here is an Ontario perspective that you shared, and the fact that, we may be deficient in Ontario in some key micronutrients. Take us through that thought.
Yeah, for the most part, our soils are relatively young. And so unlike a lot of areas of the world where their soils might be millions of years old, ours are at most 15,000 years. And so some of these deficiencies aren't as pronounced as what we might see elsewhere, but we do see several. And the ones that we see most commonly here in Ontario are going to be zinc, manganese, and boron. And in particular, when we're looking at all three, it's going to occur in one, at least, similar situation is in higher pH environments, because all three of those elements greatly increase in availability the more acid the soils become. And so if we've got high pH soils, which a lot of our soils in Ontario happen to be, then the possibility for deficiency is there.
John, talk about, I guess, the characteristics of Ontario soils and what impact they may have. You mentioned, when it comes to zinc specifically.
Yeah, our Ontario soils, like I said, they formed over the last 15,000 years ago, but the story goes back farther than that. Some 400 to maybe 700 million years ago, southern Ontario, due to continental drift, was physically at the equator under a shallow sea. And at that time, the coral that was growing in the area formed the basis of our bedrock, calcium carbonate-rich materials. After the last glaciation, that material was re-ground up and deposited to the soil surface, resulting in a pH that would have been, at the time, 8.2 all the way to the top. In the last 15,000 years, soil has reformed, and some of those carbonates have weathered out of the top and started to move down through the profile, allowing the surface soil to start reducing in pH. But a lot of our soils still have a much higher pH than most areas of the world, and as such, even with relatively high availability of these microelements, they may not be physically plant available because of that high pH.
Now, I know you're not a plant scientist, and you made that point clear here today, but tell us about, I guess, where we see zinc deficiency and what crops we might be looking at.
Yeah, in terms of zinc deficiency in Ontario, the most common crop that we see it in is corn. And again, it doesn't mean that we can't see zinc deficiency in soybean where we don't typically see it. It just means that that is a common one that we see, and we use it as a diagnostic. So the fact that we see intervenochlorosis of the younger tissues of the plant where zinc is likely to show up would give us an idea that it may in fact be zinc. But like I said in the talk, that's only the starting point. We then have to actually measure it to see, indeed, is it zinc that's deficient or is it something else? We talked about micronutrient deficiencies today, but there's any number of reasons why a plant may look sick. Maybe a toxicity from something else that we've done, maybe who knows what we've done, maybe it's lightning strike, could be hail, could be whatever. And so we need to identify that indeed that is the problem. And then we also measure it in the soil to understand whether it's an issue where there isn't enough in the soil to supply it, or whether there's a problem potentially in the plant that's inhibiting its ability to take it up.
Yeah. Let's talk about, if we have identified the problem, it is zinc, and some of the remedies we have. So you're a big fan of banding. Tell us about that.
Well, in terms of zinc, if we know that we're going to see it in the same fields on a year-by-year basis, then probably soil application makes a lot of sense. And like I said in the talk, I like the idea of banding for a number of reasons, in that concentrated band, a side band, plant roots will tend to grow like crazy in that zone. And why that's a benefit is because zinc, like phosphorus, has very limited mobility. It's only taken up from maybe a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch over the entire year. And so much of the soil system isn't going to be explored, but in that zone where we've got lots of roots growing, we might be able to better utilize that zinc that we're applying in the fertilizer, and as such make up for some of that deficiency that we, if we're going to see it in terms of zinc in corn, typically shows up during early growth.
Let's talk about manganese. And you talked about, I guess, the similarities here. I mean, when it comes to uptake, roles of pH.
Well, in terms of the pH scenario, same story. As pH decreases, manganese availability goes up rapidly. And it's one that we've got to be a little bit careful of, because very quickly it can become toxic to plants too. But the additional story with manganese is the impact of aeration. The plant available form of manganese actually exists in poor aerated environments. Not what we want for a plant. Our plant likes to be well aerated, but where we have poor aeration, that is going to form, the plant available form availability increases to a point where we could actually have toxicity created in addition to the poor aeration, causing a problem for the plant.
John, what about where you typically see this in the field? Is it those eroded knolls and areas like that?
It could very well be. And what's nice about most micronutrients that we talked about is that they show up in the younger tissues at the top of the plant. So for short plants like alfalfa and soybean, we can look from a high place and see the deficiencies showing up. But where we might see, if we're going to scout a field, is potentially in an eroded area of the field. And the reason for that comes back to that idea that our soils are formed from calcium carbonate rich parent material. So again, right after the last glaciation, the pH would have been up to 8.2 right to the surface. Since then, the pH in the surface soil has dropped. But if that surface soil is eroded away, exposing the subsurface soil, pH is going to be higher, and the potential for deficiency is there because of that high pH. Now, like I said in the talk, you have to be a bit careful with that because in some fields, those eroded areas might in fact be old sand dunes or beaches. And in those cases, those sandy spots in an otherwise clay field might actually have lower pH environments, and so something else is happening there in terms of availability. But in general, if we're looking at most of our mid-textured soils, may be a possibility there, or in a similar state, right above where we happen to put in a tile line recently, we can mix in some of that subsurface horizon, increasing the pH in that one little zone, resulting in lower availability.
What about correcting these situations, John? We talked about banding with zinc. This may be a foliar application?
Yeah, in the case of manganese, once in the soil, because the aerated version, which we want in a soil for growing a plant, is going to result in very low mobility of manganese. As soon as we apply manganese fertilizer to the soil, very quickly it forms those that source that isn't going to be plant available. It really isn't doing much for us within that year of application. Whereas a foliar application, it bypasses the soil. That doesn't occur. Plant responds to it. It's possible that we might have to do that more than once. If at a slightly later date we see the deficiency showing up again, we might have to go through the field again. But it's more likely to meet the demand of the plant than the soil application would.
Final micronutrient here, John, boron. What do we need to know about what's happening in the soils when it comes to boron?
So similar to manganese and zinc, increase in availability as pH goes down. But a little bit different in that most of the natural boron fertility comes from recently decomposed organic materials. And so if we have a high organic matter soil with lots of mineralization occurring of that organic materials, we're likely to have a lot of boron becoming available. But even in those higher organic matter soils, if it happens to dry out, we could have a temporary period where there's limited amounts of decomposition, limited amounts of boron being added. And because boron, like the other elements that we talked about, has very low mobility in the plant, the newer tissues might suffer because we can't remobilize that boron in to allow that growth to continue.
Hey, just a thought on Ontario. I mean, we're always so focused on the macros here. The big focus here today is on micros. You know, what do you say to farmers when in a fertilizer conversation about how much, perspective and how much emphasis they should be putting on micros?
Yeah, for a lot of us, probably we put more emphasis on it than what we maybe need to. It's something, like I said, that we can see relatively easily for the three big macros or micros that we tend to see deficiency in Ontario. They occur right on the top of the plant. Scout the fields. If you don't see it on a regular basis, then probably it's not a big issue. We heard a little bit about hidden deficiencies today, but that's typically really mild deficiencies, and whether or not they have a big impact on the plant, we don't know. Like all other nutrient-related questions, where I usually end up with is this idea of growers doing their own on-farm trials. Don't just simply start applying without knowing whether it's doing anything for you. Put through a couple of strips. Do we see something consistently popping up? If so, that tells you that on your farm you have a site-specific need for that new practice.
Great insights, John. Always appreciate you taking some time for Real Agriculture.
You're very welcome.